We're going to transition into taking a look at the brain. So remember last time we looked at the spinal cord, nerves and reflexes. And so here we're going to be looking at the brain. The brain is hugely complex. There could be an entire course dedicated to just looking at the brain that spans over 3 quarters. It's just crazy, all the stuff that we found out through the years that have changed. And so I just am going to kind of dabble in some areas just to set a foundation for you guys if you want to continue pursuing and digging into some of these areas of the brain that interest you. All right? So what we're going to do is kind of look at gross anatomy. And it's going to be similar to what we did last time with the spinal cord, where we're going to start off looking at the meninges and then some of the more interior structures. And then we're talking about the cerebrum, including the cerebral cortex and areas, lobes, and the functions, and then look at the white matter, which is a little bit deeper, and then look at basal nuclei, some of the deeper structures that include the basal nuclei, the diencephalon, and some of the more inferior structures, the brainstem and the cerebellum at the end. Like I said, I wish we had more time to talk about all the cool stuff that has come out about all these different interesting regions of the brain and what they do. Unfortunately, we just don't have that time to do that. So just orienting people, hopefully this is becoming, second nature to you guys. We have information flow going in, integration, and then information or a plan or execution output, right? So remember that the peripheral nervous system's going to be taking information in, sensory input. The central nervous system, that includes spinal cord and the brain, are going to be integrating that information, coming up with some sort of plan, and sending that plan out to be executed by effectors. And remember, this kind of output, this plan output from the central nervous system, if we're consciously controlling it, the effectors are skeletal muscle, that's going to be part of the somatic motor nervous system. And then the other part, which we'll talk about after exam 1, is the autonomic nervous system. So a lot of the controls that happen without us being necessarily conscious of it. All right? And so remember, those effectors are going to be, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands. All right? So breaking things up, you've seen this before, central nervous system, the 2 major structures, the spinal cord and the brain. Peripheral nervous system are going to be spinal nerves, which we kind of touched upon last time, and then talk a little bit about cranial nerves, which you guys are going to be able to investigate even more in the lab. All right? So here, central nervous system's involved with integration, and then we got sensory input and motor output, for the peripheral nervous system. It's kind of you could think of it kind of like a sandwich. The peripheral nervous system is sandwiching the central nervous system that does a lot of the integration. All right, so brain anatomy, the meninges, hopefully you guys remember a little bit about the spinal cord. What were the meninges? Anybody remember? 3 layers, yeah, and I heard some of them. So dura mater was one. Anybody remember? Yeah, that's right. Arachnoid mater. So I was trying to give you guys a hint. All right. And then pia mater, right? So what is dura mater? Literally, that's the outermost layer. What does it literally translate to? Tough mother, right? Pia mater is gentle mother, right? So here, this is a tough outer covering is the dura mater. And then we'll talk a little bit about cerebral spinal fluid. How many folks have heard of cerebral spinal fluid? Awesome. So it's really important for the brain. A lot of people don't realize there's actual cavities in the brain where cerebral spinal fluid's generated and it flows through channels. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some of the kind of functional parts of cerebrum, the deeper structures like the diencephalon, and then some of the structures that are going on their way from the brain to the spinal cord, the brain stem and the cerebellum. All right, so meninges, yeah, you guys definitely know this one, right? So remember with the spinal cord, we have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Remember the arachnoid mater gets its name because it's got these fibrils that are reaching down towards the pia mater, and there's a space underneath the arachnoid mater. Anybody remember the name of the space? Subarachnoid space, absolutely. Turns out, as a little bit of a hint, that's part of where you start seeing some of the flow of spinal fluid. All right. So here we could see that same thing when we do a blow up of this cross section here. So here we have this is going to be our dura mater, and then here we're going to have these kind of spider-like extensions. So this would be what? Arachnoid mater, and then a really thin layer here is the pia mater, right? So those are the same 3 layers. The only slight difference here is with the dura mater in the brain compared to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord actually has only a single membrane for the dura mater, and in the brain it's actually a double membrane. And so that's why you kind of see part of the dura mater is up here and part of the dura mater is down there. Kind of splits up. All right, cerebral spinal fluid. So here it's filling certain cavities. It's generated in places called the ventricles. And, you know, scientists were very clever and called these third ventricle and fourth ventricle. Where are the first 2? Right? So anybody want to guess? It's the lateral ventricles, right? So it turns out that lateral ventricles, we have 1 on each side. So those were the first 2 ventricles. And then I think that they got tired of naming them, so they just called the third and fourth ventricle after that. All right? So ventricles are basically kind of openings where we have cerebral spinal fluid. These openings are connected to each other. So there's a route that the cerebral spinal fluid goes through. So it actually flows from, you know, one of these chambers to another. And so it's difficult to look and see that on, you know, this image, but there's openings on each hemisphere of our brain. It's the lateral ventricles, and then we have a little passageway that opens up into this third ventricle, and then there's another passageway that opens up into the fourth ventricle. All right, so here, this one is called the cerebral aqueduct. I don't know if this brain actually has. Oh yeah, you can see it in this one. So here, and if you look at this brain, this cross section here, or this mid-sagittal section, you can see this opening. All right, this opening is the right ventricle. Okay, so right ventricle. And if they did the same thing on the other side, which they didn't, you would see the left ventricle. All right, so there's openings here, and you can see that here it empties into this kind of third ventricle, and then there's a passageway that leads from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. This is the cerebral aqueduct here. So when you guys get a chance, you can take a look at this. So it's difficult to project a 3D image of this structure. All right, so it turns out cerebral spinal fluid, is going to be formed a lot of times in this choroid plexus of the ventricles. There's specialized cells that do a lot of filtering, and so you get the cerebral spinal fluid is really, can be considered filtrate from the nervous tissue. So one of the things it helps do is take waste away, right? So here it's helping remove waste. The other thing is that it's also the brain actually floats in the cerebral spinal fluid. So it helps with buoyancy. And then it's also involved with cushioning. So here, since we don't have the brain right up against, say, some sort of hard bony structure, right? There's a fluid around it. It provides some cushioning. And then the last thing it does is that it's also involved with delivering nutrients. Now, it's not the only mechanism nutrients get to the brain. That's also happens when nutrients or some molecules pass from the blood across the blood-brain barrier into the brain tissue. So this is just one of the areas or one of the places that, nutrients can come in to the brain from. All right, so this is a zoomed in version of, say, one of these openings that has a choroid plexus. And so here you can see that, like I said, with some blood vessels, we can get nutrients as well as waste products being passed to and from the nervous tissue into the circulatory system. But we also can get this whole kind of grayish, bluish area is supposed to represent a zoomed in version of one of these ventricles, and this whole area is supposed to represent cerebral spinal fluid. All right, and so here you can see that you get passage between the nervous tissue and cerebral spinal fluid of nutrients and waste. Right? We also have specialized cells, right, that are helping generate cerebral spinal fluid from the blood, and then also facilitating waste removal. Right? So if you're thinking about metabolic waste that happens because nervous tissue is quite metabolically active, these neurons and other support cells can generate waste that gets transported into cerebral spinal fluid, and it is being passage through all of those chambers and those ducts. And then in some places, that waste is going to be passed across these specialized cells that are part of the choroid plexus back into the blood to be removed. Right? So if we want to track the path of some wastes, they can go from the nervous tissue to the cerebral spinal fluid and then across this choroid plexus back into the blood. Okay? Now, we could do the same thing with nutrients, right? Just reverse the order. So we can get nutrients coming in from the blood, cerebral spinal fluid production, and then pass from along these cells into, say, the nervous tissue. Now, how important are ions, or proper ion concentrations in the firing of neurons? Super, really important. So what if you didn't have enough sodium ions outside of a cell? You'd have a problem with generating action potentials and graded potentials, right? So one of the things that it's really important for is generating or maintaining a proper ion balance or electrolyte balance, right? Because we know nervous tissue is going to be extraordinarily sensitive to that, right? So that's just one example of some of the one of the roles that cerebral spinal fluid plays. All right, so the brain, the lobes are the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe. There's also another lobe called the insula, which is kind of deep. And I think before we get into talking about the cerebrum, this is one addition that I made, that probably isn't in your PowerPoint, but I'll be happy to post it. I think to understand how the brain, the structure of the brain, you have to understand a little bit how it formed. So what ended up happening in neonatal brain development, it starts off as a tube, and then what ends up happening is the brain kind of folds back on itself so that you have an outer structure and then you have some interior structures inside of it. So I think it helps to understand how it formed, to understand what the adult structures look like. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys just a few minutes of this longer video to show you kind of how the neonatal development formed the brain. Because I think it helps with understanding that, hey, listen, we've got structures that are inside. The reason they're inside and still connected is because during development, the brain went posterior and lateral and kind of enveloped, these interior structures. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys that real quick.
This tube differentiates into the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, and the spinal cord. The forebrain will develop into the cerebral cortex, which translates sensory stimulation. It also controls complex behaviors, thoughts, memories, and problem solving. The midbrain will develop into a neural relay station for sending information from the body to various sites in the brain. The hindbrain will control the most basic physiological processes, such as breathing and heart rate. The spinal cord is the pathway for conveying information between the brain and the rest of the body. Between weeks 4 and 8, the embryo grows rapidly and the face becomes recognizably human. The eyes on the side of the head begin to migrate forward and two distinct hemispheres of the cerebral cortex emerge. Between weeks 8 and 26 of the fetal stage, the cerebral cortex grows to cover the midbrain. By week 28,
you see how it kind of envelops?
The cortex expands greatly in surface area and becomes wrinkled and folded inside of the skull. Beginning at week 28 and continuing through week 40, the brain surface fills with hills and valleys called gyri and sulci. These cerebral folds and wrinkles help to create a vast neural network which allows the brain to become a highly flexible yet precise control center and processor of information.
All right. So point here is just to kind of show you how this whole complicated structure came together. You don't necessarily have to know the time points of what happens during the development. It was just to kind of show you this animation about what we're talking about, you know, how this structure developed into the complex structure we see as adults. All right. Okay, so why don't we take a 5-minute break? All right, so I think we'll go ahead and continue here. So the first part of the brain that we're going to look at the gross anatomy of is the cerebrum, which is this outer portion, right? So if I to remove, if I can, some of the interior structures, right? I'm largely left with the cerebrum. And so here we're going to talk about some of the structures that are part of the cerebrum. All right, so we're going to focus on this part of the brain first. So there's going to be 5 lobes, right, that we're going to look at. Other terms that you're going to need to know, there's obviously a right and a left hemisphere here. You can see the right and the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. And then structures that are called gyri, sulci, and fissures. So it turns out gyri are kind of the peaks, sulci are the valleys, deep valleys are called fissures. So example of, say, a fissure would be separating the right and the left hemisphere. Okay, would be a fissure. These kind of small infoldings that we have would be sulci. All right? The peaks in between the sulci are going to be gyri. All right? Yeah. Is everybody with me on that? So the peaks, so in between the sulci here, so if there's a deep groove here and a deep, or say a groove here, in between those two grooves, it's kind of a peak. That's a gyrus, gyri plural, right? And here's a sulci, and then I kind of exaggerated it, but here, deep sulci, right, are fissures. So this would be a fissure, okay? Separating the right and the left hemisphere. Everybody comfortable with terminology there? So sulci are going to be valleys, gyri are going to be peaks in between those valleys, and then fissures are going to be deep sulci. All right? And then we have, just like what we saw in the spinal cord, gray and white matter. So here the gray matter is considered cortex. So here, when we talk about the cerebral cortex, we're talking about gray matter. And generally speaking here, if I can pull this apart, okay, the cerebral cortex is going to be the outer portion here. Right? So that's where the gray matter is located. The deeper structures are where we have the white matter in the brain. So the surface of the cerebrum is made up of the cortex, and the deeper structures, so you can see it kind of in here, is where we have the white matter. So what type of neuronal cell structures would you expect to find in the cerebral cortex? So what are parts of a neuronal cell? So cerebral cortex, gray matter. So what do we say we found in the gray matter of the spinal cord? Cell bodies, right? So what are structures? Attached to the cell body, we would also have dendrites. Okay. Now, what about the white matter? What types of structures would we find in the white matter? So myelinated axons, right? So same thing that we saw with the spinal cord, we see here with the brain. Right? So gray matter is going to be containing the non-myelinated structures. Largely, those are going to be cell bodies, dendrites, and so forth. Okay? So here, if we take a coronal or a frontal section of the brain, you can see the two hemispheres, and you can see these little indentations. Those are the sulci, and they have a gyrus in between them, and then a deep sulci here would be a fissure. All right? And in order for our right and the left hemisphere to communicate with each other, there are structures to connect the right and the left hemisphere of the cortex, of the cerebrum, excuse me. Okay? Also, you can see some of these openings, right? So what are these openings? What does it have in it? Those are the ventricles, right? And then what fluid do we find in the ventricles? Cerebral spinal fluid, right? So what ventricles are we seeing up here? Those are the lateral ventricles, right? And then here is where we're starting to see the third ventricle, and then you see this aqueduct in here, right? And it goes to the fourth ventricle down here. All right? So rather than seeing a lateral or a side view, we have a frontal view. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about certain parts of the cerebrum. So if you take a look at a lateral section, let's see if oh good, look at that, it's the same orientation. So here, this is going to be anterior, posterior, right? And so here's, there's a few important structures to take a look at when looking at the lobes. So what separates these lobes? Well, let's start off with the frontal lobe. What separates the frontal lobe from the next lobe that is posterior to it is this sulcus called the central sulcus. Right? So central sulcus, you can see it running right up here. So anterior to that is the frontal lobe. Posterior to that, we start the parietal lobe. Let's say parietal lobe. The lobe that is going to be underneath or around the temporal bone is called the temporal lobe. Okay? That's separated from the parietal and the frontal lobe by this sulcus called the lateral sulcus. Right? So we have frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the last lobe of the cerebrum that we can see is something called the occipital lobe. Hopefully some of these names aren't surprising to you, because what is the bone of the cranium that is back here? Occipital bone, right? So if you remember the names of the bones, they help you with names of some of these other anatomical structures. So here, the lobes that we can see on this image: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe. Now there's another lobe that you can't see. It's deep in here. So if we were to tease apart, pull apart at this lateral sulcus and peer inside of there, we would see this fifth lobe called the insula. It's deep into here. All right, and I think I have an image a little bit later showing that. Now, another structure, so we talked about the central sulcus. Not surprisingly, on either side of the sulcus, there's a gyrus, right? So anytime you have a valley, you have peaks on both sides, right? Okay? So there's a gyrus in front of this sulcus. So this is called the pre-central gyrus. Okay? All right? The central sulcus. So here we're saying pre-central, which means before the central sulcus. Okay? It's a pre-central gyrus. Not surprisingly, there's a gyrus posterior to that. That's called the post-central gyrus. These structures are going to be really important, as we'll find out, for motor and sensory integration and output. Okay? All right? So those three terms you're going to want to remember. Pre-central gyrus, central sulcus, post-central gyrus. So three important gyri, or gyrus, gyri, and a sulcus. Okay? Now, a few other structures, even though they're not necessarily part of the cerebrum, we have cerebellum down here. Okay, so you can see it down here. Cerebellum. That name actually means small cerebrum. Cerebellum. And then we have the spinal cord, the brain stem, which is going to eventually lead into the spinal cord. Right? Part of that brain stem is going to be the medulla oblongata and also the pons, which we'll talk about, all right, a little bit later. So just to round out some of the other structures you see on this image. Okay? Everybody comfortable with the terms gyrus and sulci and fissures? Okay, good. All right. So we're going to talk about different areas of the cerebrum. And this is a gross oversimplification of it, but I think it's a good starting point for folks that haven't seen functional areas of the cerebrum, the brain, before. There's two, we're going to focus on the gray matter areas, the cortex, cerebral cortex. And really, you can break this up into what we call primary areas and association areas. So let me try to define what I mean. Primary areas are going to be, if it's a primary sensory area, where that sensory information is coming into the brain. All right, that's its first stop. Okay? Now, if we have a primary motor area, that's where the plan starts being assembled. Okay? For, say, movement of your left arm or your right leg or your left leg. That plan starts being assembled in that area, right? What about the association areas? The sensory association areas are going to be doing the interpreting and integrating information. So the primary sensory area took in the information and then passed it along to the appropriate association area, where that sensory information was integrated and interpreted, right, in that sensory association area. So what do I mean by that? You walk by Krispy Kreme, and you see a delectable donut, right? Sensory information comes in, sends it off to association area for, say, interpretation. Interpretation is, wow, that looks good, right? Okay? So that's what's happening with respect to routing of information. So anytime you see the word association, you should think integration and interpretation, all right? Primary is going to be where that sensory information has its destination in the cerebrum, and then it gets passed on to the association areas for identification and interpretation. Everybody with me on that? Does that make sense to folks? All right. Now, what about the motor equivalent? So, like I said, the primary area, for motor is putting together a plan for movement. The actual setting that plan out is going to be up to the motor association area. So it's integrating all this other information, right? So you got a plan to go and get yourself a Krispy Kreme donut, right? Well, you're across the street, a busy street. Are you just going to simply walk straight across the street? Probably not. So you got to integrate information as where's the crosswalk? When do I cross? What's the safest route? Do I have enough money? Right? All this information has to be routed in. In addition to, being able to put one foot in front of the other. That's actually a really complicated task. It doesn't seem like it, but it is. You have to integrate all this information in order for this plan to be sent out. Right? So here we have the primary motor areas where we're starting to assemble a plan for movement, and then the motor areas is where we integrate all those inputs to send that execution for that plan out. Right? Sends the plan to be executed. So in this case, that plan for execution is going to mostly our skeletal muscles. We're going to walk over a Krispy Kreme and get us our donut. All right? So are there any questions? Because this happens over and over again. These primary areas and association areas. A lot of times they have the word primary and association in the name, or association in the name. But sometimes they don't. But if you know what the function is, you can guess as to whether it probably you could categorize it as a primary or a association area. All right. Another part of the cortex that maybe you've heard of is something called the prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain is the very anterior part of the cortex, the prefrontal cortex. This is involved in a lot of the executive functions, we say. So a lot of this terminology is used a lot in neuroscience and neurobiology. So executive function. What do executive functions mean? That means the overall kind of dispersing of information, interpreting, integrating, and we're talking about reasoning and judgment, right? So higher order, types of, information is coming from this area. Individuals, so we know a lot about what these different parts of the brain do because of people that have had lesions or have had damage to certain parts of their brain. What are they no longer able to do? Individuals that have damage to the prefrontal cortex, they have damages in a lot of these executive functions. So are they going to have the same ability for judgment? No. So they could have, where before their injury, they're pretty reasonable and they were able to integrate social cues so they didn't say inappropriate things. Individuals that have problems in this part of their brain, they impair that judgment. And so they can be, having difficulty reasoning, saying inappropriate things at inappropriate times and so forth. All right? Okay, so keep this in mind, this kind of primary and association area. It's a super oversimplification, but it's going to kind of help with what some of the things are that we're going to talk about. Go ahead, Charles. I think for our benefit, we could lump it in there. But you do have some planning that goes on and some sensory information, that goes on so that it's probably, you could consider it a little bit of a master association area that kind of oversees a lot of these things. Yeah. It's, like I said, this is a super oversimplification. There's shades of gray, in here, but I think for the first, for people seeing this the first time, I think it's a good way to start off with trying to figure out the functional areas. All right, so we're going to first start off with looking at sensory information. Okay? Remember that primary sensory areas, we're getting information from some sort of receptor. Some sensory receptor was triggered, and then that information was routed. How did it get to the brain? it had to go to the spinal cord first, right? Okay. Now, which route did it come through to get to the spinal cord? Anybody remember? So it's sensory information. Dorsal root, which means that which horn did it get into? Dorsal horn, right? Remember, everything that's dorsal is always sensory. D before V, right? Before we can have some motor output, we have to have some sensory input. I don't know that I want to get a Krispy Kreme donut until I see a Krispy Kreme donut, right? Okay? So here, this sensory information is coming in via the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, and then it's being routed to one of those tracks that's going up to the brain. A lot of times, they're going to be routed up to the part of the brain called the thalamus. We'll find out that's a major relay center. Okay? So this could be, starts off in the spine and gets routed to the thalamus. So what type of tract? What would be that tract called? Spinothalamic tract, right? So we saw that on the quiz. Okay? All right, so here, where is it going to be routed to ultimately in the cortex? Well, remember, where's the first place the sensory information comes into? A primary area or association area? Primary, right? So sensory information is going to be routed to a primary area. That primary area is going to be the postcentral gyrus. So I told, like I said, you know, that precentral and postcentral gyrus and central sulcus, those are three prominent structures that you're going to encounter over and over again. And remember, this is part of the parietal lobe because that central sulcus, right, the central sulcus is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe, right? The postcentral gyrus, which is what we're talking about here, okay, is going to be in the parietal lobe, okay? All right, so our sensory information, the primary sensory area, we call the primary sensory or primary somatosensory cortex, okay? Now, we also have primary areas for other specialized senses. So there's a primary visual area, okay? It's located in the occipital lobe. Usually, the primary area and the association area are in close proximity to each other. They're in anatomical proximity to each other. So other specialized structures we also have primary and association areas for are also for hearing. We have a primary auditory region area that's located in the temporal lobe, right? There's also a primary olfactory area also located in the temporal lobe. So if someone has a lesion in the temporal lobe, which senses might be affected? Yeah, so olfactory and hearing. Right. So individuals that have, say, hallucinations, you can have olfactory hallucinations, or you smell something that's not there. And you can also have auditory hallucinations. Those can occur because of lesions in the temporal lobe. So gustatory is located in that deep part, that deep lobe called the insula. Gustatory means tasting. So we have a primary gustatory area. It's involved with tasting. And then we also have sensory information coming in from our viscera that's also located in the insula. And so when I say viscera, I'm talking about a lot of the internal organs. All right, so last one is primary vestibular. So anybody know what I mean by vestibular? So vestibular generally is referring to equilibrium and balance. Now, what specialized structure does that? Anybody know? So it's our inner ear. Okay, our inner ear is able to do that. So being able to move our heads in a certain direction, know whether we're leaning forward, back, side to side, for instance. Okay? Whether we're spinning or not. All right, so there's a primary area for this, also located in the insula. Okay, so here's just a location, and I'll get to your question in just a second, just to show that if you pull back on the lateral sulcus, you can see the insula underneath it, right? And so you can see that we have our primary sensory cortex, right? And then we have our occipital lobe with our primary visual cortex. And then with our temporal lobe, we can see our primary auditory region. And then we have the primary auditory cortex. And then where's our olfactory? There's our olfactory, right? Okay. All right. Sorry, go ahead, Charles. Touch? Oh, yeah. So that's going into the primary sensory cortex. Yep. So that is going to be taken in a lot of those somatosensory input. Touch is a primary one, though. Okay. So when I talk about somatosensory, we're talking about, touch, feel, and so forth. All right, so I think we'll leave it there, and then we'll pick up next time with looking at a little bit more of this primary somatosensory cortex as well as association areas. All right?